Darius Whitmore stood at the podium, cameras flashing. 24 hours ago, airport security dragged him off. Flight 447 inches handcuffs. Today, Northwest Atlantic Airlines lost $4 billion in market value. His bruised face filled every screen worldwide. But nobody knew the truth yet. Nobody knew what that boarding pass really meant. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you believe justice matters, hit that like button right now. And make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment of how one man's nightmare became a revolution that changed everything. Now, let's go back to where it all started. 2 days before the incident that would shake corporate America to its core, Darius Whitmore sat in his small apartment in Capitol Hill, Seattle, carefully folding clothes into his suitcase. At 32 years old, he had finally reached the pinnacle moment of his career. The ceiling fan above him spun slowly, barely moving the warm evening air as he checked his laptop for the 100th time that day. Everything had to be perfect. Everything had to work. This presentation in Washington, D.C. could change his entire life, and he knew it with every fiber of his being. Darius stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with a lean frame that spoke of long hours spent in front of computer screens rather than in gyms. His dark skin glowed under the apartment's soft lighting, and behind his gold-rimmed glasses, his brown eyes carried both intelligence and a certain weariness that came from years of working twice as hard to get half the recognition. He wore a crisp white shirt even at home, always professional, always prepared, always proving himself worthy of the opportunities he'd fought so hard to earn. His small apartment reflected his solitary lifestyle, furnished simply with a desk covered in monitors, a comfortable chair worn from countless hours of coding, and walls decorated only with framed certificates marking his academic and professional achievements. 5 years had passed since his mother died, leaving him truly alone in the world. His father had vanished when Darius was just 7 years old, disappearing one morning without explanation or goodbye, leaving behind only questions that would never be answered. His mother had raised him alone, working 3 jobs to send him to good schools, sacrificing everything so her brilliant son could have the future she never had. When cancer took her at 53, Darius threw himself even deeper into his work, finding solace in code and algorithms, building systems that made sense when the world often did not. The project he'd been working on for 18 months represented the culmination of everything he'd learned, everything he'd built, everything he'd become. His artificial intelligence security system for government installations had passed every test, exceeded every expectation, and caught the attention of the Defense Committee in Washington. They wanted him there, in person, to present his work to officials who controlled budgets worth billions of dollars. Forbes had named him to their 30 under 30 list 2 years earlier. Technology companies constantly tried to recruit him, and his salary had climbed to heights his mother could never have imagined. But this presentation mattered more than all of that combined, because it represented validation, respect, recognition that his work truly mattered on the national stage. He checked his email again and found the confirmation from his supervisor, Margaret Chen, who'd written in her characteristically direct style that this meeting could secure their company's future for the next decade. The pressure sat heavy on his shoulders, but Darius had never backed down from pressure. Had thrived on it, used it, transformed it into fuel that drove him forward when others might have quit. His flight was scheduled for 6 o'clock the following morning on Northwest Atlantic Airlines Flight 447, departing from Seattle-Tacoma International Airport and arriving at Reagan National just after 2 in the afternoon, giving him plenty of time to reach the Pentagon by 4 o'clock for his presentation. Sleep came fitfully that night as his mind raced through his presentation slides, anticipated questions, planned responses. He dreamed of standing before serious men and women in uniforms decorated with medals and ribbons, explaining how his system could protect the nation's most sensitive installations from cyber threats that grew more sophisticated every day. In his dreams, they nodded with approval, shook his hand, welcomed him into circles of power and influence, where people like him rarely found themselves invited. He woke before his alarm, showered quickly, dressed in his best charcoal gray suit with a deep blue tie, and triple-checked his black leather briefcase to ensure his laptop, backup drive, and presentation materials were all secure. The cab ride to the airport took 40 minutes through early morning darkness, and Darius watched the city lights blur past his window while mentally rehearsing his opening remarks. He arrived at 4:30, wanting extra time to navigate security and reach his gate without stress or rush. The terminal buzzed with early morning travelers, and fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in their harsh, artificial glow. Head printed his boarding pass the day before during a test run to the airport, wanting to ensure everything would proceed smoothly, but even that simple act had felt strange when the airline counter representative kept asking to see his identification multiple times, kept checking her computer screen with a frown, kept calling her supervisor over for whispered consultations that ended with apologetic smiles and assurances that everything was fine, completely standard procedure, nothing to worry about. At 4:30 in the morning, Seattle-Tacoma International Airport hummed with the peculiar energy of early flights and tired travelers desperate to reach their destinations. Darius walked through the automatic doors into the departure terminal, pulling his small roller suitcase behind him with one hand while gripping his briefcase tightly in the other. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed especially harsh at this hour, washing out colors and making everyone look slightly ill. He joined the security line, which moved slowly despite the early hour, and tried to calm the nervous energy that made his heart beat faster than necessary. When his turn came, Darius lifted his briefcase and suitcase onto the conveyor belt, then carefully placed his laptop in a gray plastic bin, followed by his belt, his wallet, his phone, his keys, and finally his shoes. Had flown dozens of times before and knew the routine perfectly, moving efficiently through each step while the TSA agent watched with an expression of bored neutrality. Darius walked through the metal detector, and immediately the machine beeped loudly. The sound seemed to echo through the security area, drawing looks from other travelers. Travis Holden, the TSA agent manning the metal detector, held up his hand and gestured for Darius to step back through and try again. Travis stood about 5 feet 10 inches tall, with a considerable belly that strained against his dark blue uniform, thinning gray hair combed over a shiny scalp, and a red face that suggested either high blood pressure or a fondness for alcohol, or possibly both. Had worked airport security for 15 years, and carried himself with the particular brand of authority that comes from having power over others in small but meaningful ways. Darius stepped back through the detector, raised his arms, and walked forward again. The machine beeped again, the same loud, insistent sound that made nearby passengers turn to stare. Travis frowned deeply and pointed to an area off to the side where Darius should stand while he received a pat-down inspection. 2 more TSA agents appeared as if summoned by some invisible signal, a tall, thin man named Mitchell with acne-scarred cheeks, and a heavy-set woman named Karen whose stern expression suggested she took her job very seriously indeed. Travis approached Darius and began patting him down, running his hands along Darius' arms, across his chest, down his sides, along his legs, with a roughness that seemed unnecessary but not quite rough enough to justify complaint. Other travelers in line watched openly now, whispering to their companions, some pulling out phones to check the time while casting curious glances at whatever drama was unfolding. Darius kept his hands raised and his expression neutral, determined not to show the humiliation burning in his chest. Had been through this before. random additional screenings that never felt quite as random as they claimed to be. But today of all days he needed everything to go smoothly. Travis finished the pat-down and walked over to the conveyor belt where Darius' belongings had piled up, waiting to be claimed. He grabbed the briefcase and began opening every pocket, pulling out papers, pens, business cards, examining each item with exaggerated care before tossing it back inside without any attempt at organization. When Travis reached the laptop, he held it up and turned to Darius with narrowed eyes that held more suspicion than any innocent computer should warrant. He asked what Darius did for work, and Darius explained patiently that he was a software engineer traveling to Washington for an important government presentation. Travis' frown deepened at this information, and he called Mitchell and Karen over for a whispered consultation, during which all three kept glancing at Darius with expressions that ranged from suspicion to outright hostility. After several minutes of discussion, Travis informed Darius that they needed to take him to a private screening room for additional security measures. The private screening room turned out to be a small windowless space, with cinder block walls painted institutional beige, a metal table bolted to the floor, 2 folding chairs, and lighting so bright it made Darius' eyes water. The 3 TSA agents followed him inside, and Travis closed the door with a firm click that somehow sounded ominous in the confined space. For the next 30 minutes, they questioned Darius about every aspect of his trip. Who was paying for his ticket? His company, he explained, showing them the corporate credit card receipt on his phone. What exactly would he be presenting in Washington? A cybersecurity system for government installations, he explained, being careful not to reveal any classified details. Why did he need to take his laptop? Because the presentation materials were on it, he explained, with patience wearing increasingly thin. Mitchell demanded the password to Darius' laptop, claiming they needed to inspect the contents for security purposes. But Darius refused as politely as he could manage, while anger bubbled underneath his calm exterior. The data on that laptop was proprietary, classified in some cases, protected by non-disclosure agreements and federal regulations. He couldn't simply hand over access to anyone who demanded it, even TSA agents claiming security concerns. This refusal seemed to confirm whatever suspicions the agents harbored, and their questions became more aggressive, more pointed, more clearly designed to intimidate rather than investigate any legitimate security threat. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. 5 o'clock became 5:15, then 5:30, then 5:45, as the interrogation continued in circles. Darius checked his watch repeatedly, anxiety mounting with each passing minute, knowing his boarding time was approaching rapidly. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was actually only 35 minutes, Travis announced they were done, and Darius could collect his belongings. No apology came, no explanation for the delay, no acknowledgement that perhaps they'd overstepped their authority or wasted his time on nothing more than suspicion born from bias they'd never admit to holding. Darius gathered his scattered belongings, shoving papers back into his briefcase in no particular order, his hands shaking slightly with suppressed anger and stress. He glanced at his watch and felt his stomach drop. It was 5:50. His flight boarded at 5:45 and closed the doors at 6 o'clock sharp. He had 10 minutes to reach Gate B-17, which according to the terminal map sat at the far end of Concourse B. At least a 10-minute walk even without crowds. Darius ran, his dress shoes slapping against the polished floor, his briefcase banging against his leg, his roller suitcase bouncing and skittering behind him as he wove between slower travelers who called out in annoyance as he rushed past. Darius reached Gate B-17 at 5:57, breathing hard, sweat dampening his shirt collar despite the airport's air conditioning. The gate area looked nearly empty, most passengers already aboard the aircraft visible through the windows, settling into their seats stowing luggage in overhead bins. Only a few stragglers remained, hurrying down the jet bridge with the frantic energy of people who know they've nearly missed their flight. At the podium stood two Northwest Atlantic Airlines employees in crisp navy blue uniforms, and Darius approached them with his boarding pass already pulled up on his phone, hoping to move through quickly and get to his seat before the doors closed. Bethany Crawford looked up as Darius approached, her blue eyes sweeping over him with an expression that shifted from neutral to guarded in the space of a heartbeat. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, with blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, sharp features set in a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and the bearing of someone who took rule-following very seriously. Next to her stood Raymond Chen, younger and less certain, fidgeting with his scanner as though it might bite him. Darius handed Bethany his phone, showing the boarding pass QR code on the screen, and she scanned it with practiced efficiency. The scanner beeped, but instead of the usual green light indicating successful boarding, a red light flashed, and the machine emitted an error tone that seemed unnecessarily loud in the now quiet gate area. Bethany frowned at her screen, tapped it several times, then scanned Darius' boarding pass again with the same result: red light, error tone, escalating confusion. She glanced at Raymond, then back at Darius, then called out to someone in the back office. Within moments, a third airline employee emerged, a man in his early 50s with a name tag identifying him as Gerald Thompson, supervisor. Gerald had the look of someone who'd worked in customer service too long, with thinning gray hair, tired eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and shoulders that seemed permanently hunched from years of dealing with complaints and problems, and passengers who made his job harder than it needed to be. Gerald took the scanner from Bethany and tried again with the same result. He frowned deeply, typed something into the computer at the podium, waited for the screen to load, then announced in a tone that brooked no argument that there appeared to be an issue with Darius' ticket, and they'd need to verify the booking before allowing him to board. Darius felt ice water pour down his spine. He explained that his company had booked this ticket 3 weeks ago, that he had the confirmation email, that had already cleared security, and just needed to get on this plane because he had an extremely important meeting in Washington that could not be missed or rescheduled. Gerald listened with the expression of someone who'd heard every excuse and story and desperate plea that passengers could invent, and responded in the flat tone of official policy that they needed to contact the airline's headquarters to clear whatever flag had appeared in the system. It was policy, he said, nothing personal, just following procedures that existed for everyone's safety and security. Darius pulled out his phone to show the email confirmation, the receipt, the entire paper trail of his legitimate, paid-for, confirmed booking. But Gerald barely glanced at the screen before repeating that they needed to verify with headquarters, and that would take time, and Darius would need to step aside to allow other passengers to board. Other passengers. Darius looked around the gate area and saw it was empty except for himself and the airline employees. The jet bridge door stood open, the aircraft visible beyond it, and he could see flight attendants beginning their final checks before departure. He checked his watch. 5:59. 1 minute until the official departure time, though planes often held the doors a few extra minutes for late passengers. But Gerald showed no inclination to bend policy or show any flexibility whatsoever. Darius felt desperation rising in his throat like bile, and heard his own voice grow louder as he insisted this was ridiculous, that his ticket was valid, that he needed to board this flight immediately. Gerald's expression hardened at Darius' raised voice, and he responded with the particular coldness that comes from someone using policy as a weapon rather than a guideline. He told Darius to calm down, or they'd need to call security. Calm down. Those 2 words that people always said when they wanted you to know that your anger, however justified, would be used against you. Darius took a breath, and tried to speak more quietly, more reasonably, explaining again that this was discrimination, that he was being delayed for no legitimate reason, that Head done nothing wrong and just wanted to board the flight, Head paid for and had every right to take. But the word discrimination seemed to act as a trigger. Gerald's face flushed red, and he reached for the radio clipped to his belt, speaking into it with measured calm that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. He reported a situation at gate B-17, a passenger refusing to comply with instructions, requesting security assistance. Darius felt the moment shift, felt control slip away, felt the trap closing around him. Even though Head done nothing, except try to board a plane, he had every legal right to board. He protested that he was complying, that he just wanted to get on his flight. But his words seemed to evaporate into air that had grown thick and heavy with tension. Within 90 seconds, 3 airport security officers arrived, striding into the gate area with the confident swagger of armed men accustomed to compliance. The lead officer, whose name tag read Drake, stood well over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders, a thick neck, and cold gray eyes that swept over Darius with the kind of assessment cops and soldiers learn, categorizing threat levels and calculating responses. He wore the standard airport security uniform with a reflective vest, a radio, pepper spray on one hip, and an expandable baton on the other, the tools of sanctioned violence displayed openly as both warning and promise. Officer Drake asked Gerald what the problem was, and Gerald explained in a tone of aggrieved professionalism that this passenger had become aggressive and refused to step aside after being informed of an issue with his ticket. Aggressive. Darius wanted to scream at the injustice of that word, at the way his legitimate frustration at being wrongly delayed was transformed into threatening behavior simply by passing through lips that had already decided what story they wanted to tell. He tried to explain his side, but Drake cut him off with a raised hand and told him, in a voice used to obedience, that he needed to come with them. They'd sort this out away from the gate. He could either walk peacefully or be escorted. Darius looked at the 3 officers, at their hands resting casually near their weapons, at the jet bridge door beginning to close as the final boarding time passed, and felt something crack inside his chest. His career, his presentation, his one shot at the validation Head worked his entire life to earn, all of it slipping away because of suspicion and prejudice wrapped in the language of policy and procedure. He raised his voice, not threatening, not aggressive, but loud enough to be heard, demanding that someone record this, that this was racial profiling, that they were violating his rights. Drake's expression shifted from neutral authority to active hostility, and he gestured to his fellow officers. They moved in quickly, professionally, with the practiced coordination of people who'd done this many times before. They grabbed Darius' arms, twisted them behind his back with force that made him gasp in pain, and when he instinctively tried to pull away, they drove him down to the floor. His knees hit the industrial carpet hard enough to send bolts of pain shooting up his legs. His glasses flew off his face and skittered across the floor, and then his chest was pressed against the ground with one officer's knee between his shoulder blades pinning him down. Darius shouted that they were hurting him, that he hadn't done anything wrong, but his protests meant nothing to men following protocols that justified whatever force they deemed necessary. They pulled plastic zip-tie handcuffs tight around his wrists, the plastic biting into his skin, cutting off circulation, marking him as threat, as criminal, as problem to be contained and removed. They hauled him to his feet, and Drake grabbed his arm with bruising force and began marching him away from the gate, away from his flight, away from everything Head worked toward. As they dragged him through the terminal, Darius was dimly aware of phones appearing, of passengers recording video, of shocked faces and whispered conversations. Someone called out asking if he was okay, and one of the officers barked at bystanders to move along. Nothing to see. Return to your business. But there was something to see, something that would be seen by millions before the day ended. The video started uploading to social media before Darius even reached the security office where they would hold him, process him, transform him from passenger to problem, from citizen to suspect, all without ever charging him with any actual crime. The security holding room felt deliberately designed to break spirits and induce confession through discomfort alone. 4 walls of painted cinder block, in that particular shade of institutional beige that exists only in government buildings, prisons, and places where hope goes to die. A metal table bolted to the floor sat in the center, flanked by 2 metal chairs that offered no comfort despite their utilitarian purpose. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, panels of sickly white illumination that cast no shadows and made the small space feel even smaller. Claustrophobic, like the walls might slowly close in until there wasn't room to breathe. Darius sat in one of the chairs with his hands still bound behind his back, the plastic zip ties cutting deeper into his wrists every time he shifted position. His glasses remained somewhere on the floor near gate B-17, leaving the world slightly out of focus, adding to the surreal nightmare quality of everything happening. Officer Drake sat across from him, a clipboard and pen positioned precisely on the table between them, while the other 2 officers stood by the door like sentries guarding a dangerous criminal, rather than a software engineer who'd simply tried to board a plane. Drake began asking questions in a tone that managed to be both bored and accusatory at once. Full name, address, employer, reason for travel. Darius answered each question clearly and completely, maintaining his composure despite the rage and fear churning in his gut. He explained again about the presentation, about his legitimate business travel, about his confirmed and paid-for ticket. Drake wrote nothing down, just watched Darius with those cold gray eyes that had already decided guilt before hearing evidence. When Darius asked why he was being detained, what crime he was being accused of, Drake responded that multiple airline employees and passengers reported aggressive behavior, threatening language, refusal to comply with lawful instructions from airline staff. Darius felt his jaw drop in shock at this complete fabrication of reality. Head raised his voice out of frustration. Yes, but threatening, aggressive? Had been the one attacked, thrown to the ground, handcuffed, dragged away. He tried to explain this, but Drake cut him off with a raised hand and a warning that arguing would only make things worse. Darius asked to call his lawyer, a right he knew he possessed, regardless of whether Head been formally arrested. Drake consulted with his fellow officers in whispered tones, then informed Darius that this wasn't a police matter yet, just an internal airline security issue, and they needed to complete their investigation before determining whether criminal charges would be filed. Until then, Darius would wait here while they gathered statements and reviewed footage. His phone had been confiscated along with his other belongings, leaving him completely isolated from anyone who might help. Time crawled by with agonizing slowness. 6:30 came and went. His flight departed without him, carrying away his briefcase and suitcase that had already been loaded into the cargo hold, leaving him with only his wallet and the clothes on his back. 7 o'clock arrived, then 7:30, marking the time when he should have been landing in Washington, collecting his luggage, catching a cab to his hotel. Instead, he sat in this ugly room with his hands bound, his career disintegrating, his reputation being destroyed by lies told by people who would face no consequences for their false accusations. Drake returned at 8 o'clock with papers in hand and an expression that suggested Head made decisions Darius wouldn't like. He announced that after reviewing statements from airline personnel and consulting with Northwest Atlantic Airlines management, they'd determined Darius posed a security risk and would be placed on the airline's no-fly list pending further investigation. He could not board any Northwest Atlantic flight until the matter was resolved, which could take weeks or months depending on how backed up the review process was. Furthermore, his name and photograph would be shared with other airlines as a potentially disruptive passenger. Darius stared at Drake in disbelief, bordering on shock. A no-fly list. His name shared with other airlines. His ability to travel destroyed. His career crippled. All because he'd been delayed and profiled, and then dared to object to that treatment. He asked, in a voice that shook, despite his efforts to control it, what evidence they had, what proof existed of any threatening behavior. But Drake simply shuffled his papers and said the decision was final and Darius would be released now but should expect to be contacted for additional questioning. They cut the zip ties, finally, and blood rushed back into Darius' hands with painful pins and needles that made him gasp. Red marks circled both wrists where the plastic had cut into skin. Drake handed him his phone, wallet, and a business card with a case number written on it, then informed him that his luggage would be flagged at baggage claim in Washington, and he could contact the airline about having it shipped back to Seattle. With that, the officers escorted him out of the security area, through corridors lined with signs about vigilance and safety, and deposited him back in the main terminal as though nothing of consequence had occurred. Darius stood in the middle of the bustling airport, feeling utterly lost, his world shattered, his future destroyed, and for what? For being black in an airport, for being black with a boarding pass, for being black and daring to expect equal treatment. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and saw 63 missed calls, hundreds of text messages, notifications piling up so fast the screen couldn't keep up. Something had happened while he'd been detained. Something big, but his shocked mind couldn't process what. He opened Twitter and his timeline exploded with his own face. The video. Someone had posted video of his arrest at the gate, and it had gone viral with terrifying speed. 5 million views in 3 hours. 10 million. 15. The footage showed everything. Him trying to board. Being delayed. Being thrown to the ground. Being handcuffed. And dragged away, while shouting that this was discrimination. Comments flooded in by the thousands. People expressing outrage, demanding justice, calling for boycotts of Northwest Atlantic Airlines. Have you ever been treated unfairly because of how you look? Comment the number 1 if you think what happened to Darius was wrong, and remember to hit that like button if you believe everyone deserves equal treatment regardless of their skin color. Make sure you're subscribed because what happens next will show you how one man's courage sparked a movement that corporations couldn't ignore. But first, let me ask you this. If you were in Darius' position, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet? Would you have fought back? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to share this video with anyone who needs to hear this story. Now, let's see how the world responded. Simone Harper received the phone call at 6:30 in the evening while reviewing case files in her Georgetown office, a converted brownstone that served as headquarters for her civil rights law practice. At 40 years old, she'd built a reputation as one of the nation's most fearsome advocates for victims of discrimination, taking on corporations, police departments, and government agencies with equal ferocity. Her dark skin, natural hair styled in elegant locks, and penetrating brown eyes that missed nothing had become familiar sights on cable news programs whenever racial justice issues dominated headlines. The call came from a paralegal who'd seen the viral video and recognized immediately that this case represented everything their firm fought against. Within 2 hours, Simone had assembled a team, chartered a flight to Seattle, and made contact with Darius through mutual connections in the civil rights community. She found him sitting in his apartment, still wearing his rumpled suit from the morning, staring at his laptop screen, displaying thousands upon thousands of messages of support, mixed with hate mail from people who insisted he must have done something to deserve such treatment. He looked up when she knocked, and Simone saw in his eyes the particular devastation that comes when you realize the system you believed in has betrayed you completely. She introduced herself, sat down across from him, and listened as he recounted every detail of the morning's events. As he spoke, Simone took careful notes, her legal mind already constructing the framework of the case she'd build, identifying the violations, calculating the damages, planning the strategy that would bring Northwest Atlantic Airlines to its knees. When Darius finished his story, voice hoarse from talking and emotion, Simone looked him in the eye and made a promise. They would not only clear his name but expose the rot at the heart of the airline's security procedures. The next morning, Simone filed emergency motions in federal court demanding Northwest Atlantic Airlines produce all records related to Darius booking, the security flag that had triggered the gate delay, and any policies or procedures that governed how such flags were generated and applied. The airline's lawyers responded with the standard corporate playbook, claiming privacy concerns, proprietary business information, and the necessity of maintaining confidential security protocols. But Simone had anticipated this response and had already prepared arguments citing civil rights law, discrimination statutes, and legal precedents that required transparency when security measures had disparate impact on protected classes. The federal judge, Honorable Patricia Blackwell, a 60-year-old black woman who'd spent her career fighting discrimination before ascending to the bench, took one look at the viral video, read Simone's motion, and issued an order compelling Northwest Atlantic Airlines to produce the requested documents within 48 hours under penalty of contempt. The airline's lawyers scrambled, filed appeals that were rejected, and finally, reluctantly, delivered boxes of documents to Simone's team with black redaction marks covering large sections of text. But they hadn't redacted carefully enough. The documents revealed a system built on bias, disguised as data-driven security. Northwest Atlantic Airlines had implemented an artificial intelligence algorithm designed to flag high-risk passengers based on multiple factors. And the algorithm's training data came from arrest records, watch lists, and historical security incidents that already contained massive racial bias. The result was predictable and damning. Black passengers, particularly black men, particularly those traveling alone, particularly those who'd booked tickets to certain cities, including Washington, D.C., received automatic risk scores significantly higher than white passengers with identical booking patterns. Darius' ticket had been flagged not because of anything he'd done, not because of any actual suspicious behavior, but because an algorithm trained on racist data had marked him as dangerous for being black. The system worked exactly as designed, encoding centuries of prejudice into lines of code, automating discrimination while allowing the humans operating it to claim objectivity. And Northwest Atlantic Airlines knew. Internal emails showed that the algorithm's developers had warned about potential bias issues 3 years earlier, but executives had decided the false positive rate was acceptable, given the system's efficiency at reducing security incidents. Some people would be inconvenienced, perhaps even humiliated, but that was the price of safety. And besides, who would know? Simone found emails that turned her stomach with their casual cruelty. The vice president of operations, Gerald Farnsworth, had written in response to bias concerns, "The algorithm works within acceptable parameters. Customer complaints are minimal and manageable. Who cares if some people are upset? We're running an airline, not a social justice organization." That email alone would be worth millions in punitive damages. But it also revealed something worse. This wasn't ignorance or unintentional bias. This was deliberate, calculated discrimination, dressed up in technology's neutral language. Additional investigation revealed that Darius wasn't alone. Simone's team identified over 10,000 instances in the past 3 years, where black passengers had been flagged by the algorithm, subjected to additional screening, delayed, or denied boarding entirely. They found patterns of black passengers being moved to different seats after booking, assigned to less desirable flights, charged higher prices for identical service. Northwest Atlantic Airlines had built systemic racism into every level of their operation, from ticketing to boarding to in-flight service. and they'd profited from it while their victims suffered in silence, thinking their individual experiences were isolated incidents rather than pieces of a much larger pattern. Darius sat in Simone's temporary Seattle office, reading through the documents with growing horror and anger. Had spent his entire career working with artificial intelligence, building systems meant to be fair and transparent and accountable. And here was proof that his own industry's tools could be weaponized against people like him. The algorithm that had destroyed his reputation wasn't some neutral machine making objective decisions. It was racism encoded into software, given the authority of technology, deployed against thousands of innocent people, while the company executives counted their profits and dismissed the suffering they caused. Simone scheduled a press conference for the following day, giving her team 24 hours to prepare a presentation that would make the evidence impossible to ignore or explain away. They worked through the night, creating charts and graphs showing the disparate impact, compiling testimonials from other victims who'd come forward after seeing Darius' video, organizing the emails and documents into a narrative that demonstrated not just bias, but intentional discrimination at the highest corporate levels. Meanwhile, the pressure on Northwest Atlantic Airlines intensified with each passing hour. The initial viral video had been shared millions of times, but now came the personal stories. A black doctor delayed and humiliated on her way to a medical conference. A black veteran returning from his father's funeral subjected to aggressive questioning and searches. A black college student flying home for Thanksgiving who'd missed his flight after being pulled aside for additional screening that lasted 3 hours. Thousands of stories, thousands of victims, all emerging into the light, because Darius had dared to say what happened to him was wrong. The airline's stock price, which had initially dropped 12% on the day of the incident, continued falling as the scope of the scandal became clear. Major institutional investors began dumping shares, worried about legal liability and reputational damage. Corporate partners started distancing themselves, with 3 major credit card companies announcing they'd suspend their co-branded Northwest Atlantic cards pending investigation of discrimination allegations. The pilots' union issued a statement condemning the airline's security policies. Flight attendants began organizing protests demanding management changes. The Grand Hyatt Seattle ballroom had been transformed into a media circus by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, with cameras from every major news network positioned on risers at the back, lights on stands creating artificial daylight, and over 200 journalists crowding into seats designed for half that number. Simone had chosen the location carefully, wanting a space large enough to accommodate the massive media interest, while professional enough to convey the seriousness of the accusations they were about to level. The hotel staff had set up a long table at the front with microphones positioned precisely, water glasses filled and waiting, and a large screen on the wall behind where they'd project the evidence. Darius sat in a small preparation room off the main ballroom, wearing a new Navy suit. Simone's team had purchased that morning since his luggage remained somewhere in the Northwest Atlantic Airlines system, possibly lost forever. He could hear the murmur of the crowd through the walls, the occasional burst of laughter as journalists greeted colleagues, the technical discussions of camera operators testing their equipment. His hands shook slightly as he reviewed his statement one final time, and Simone noticed, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. She told him in her firm, confident voice that had been incredibly brave to come forward, that what he was about to do would change things not just for himself, but for thousands of people who'd suffered similar treatment. Darius nodded, not trusting himself to speak without his voice breaking. The bruises on his face from being thrown to the airport floor had darkened to deep purple and yellow, and the makeup artist they'd hired couldn't fully conceal them. "Good," Simone had said. "Let people see what their security policies look like in practice." At precisely 2:30, Simone opened the door and they walked together into the ballroom. immediately hit by a wall of camera flashes so bright Darius had to squint despite his new glasses. The journalists erupted with shouted questions, all talking over each other in their desperation to get the first quote. Simone raised her hand, and the room gradually quieted, though the energy remained electric with anticipation. She stepped to the microphone and began speaking in the clear, measured tones of someone who'd done this many times before, but never lost the passion that drove her. She introduced herself, provided brief background on her firm's civil rights work, then turned to introduce Darius. He stood, and another wave of camera flashes nearly blinded him. He stepped to the microphone and began reading from the statement they'd prepared, his voice steady despite the emotions churning inside. He recounted the events at the airport in careful detail, describing the delays, the humiliation, the violence, the lies told about his behavior to justify the treatment. As he spoke, the room remained absolutely silent, except for the clicking of camera shutters and the occasional scratch of pen on paper as print journalists took notes. Then Darius reached the part of his statement where Head insisted on adding his own words, moving away from the careful legal language Simone had drafted. He looked up from his paper directly into the cameras and said, in a voice that carried pain and strength in equal measure, that he was not a criminal, not a threat, not whatever stereotype had been programmed into an algorithm that judged him guilty of being black. He was an engineer who'd dedicated his career to building systems that protected people, and instead had been betrayed by a system built to target people like him. His voice cracked on the last words, and tears rolled down his cheeks, mixing with the makeup meant to hide his bruises. He didn't wipe them away. "Let them see," Simone had said. "Let them see what this costs." The room remained silent for several long seconds after he finished. Journalists processing what they'd heard, calculating angles for their stories, but also, perhaps, feeling something human beneath their professional detachment. Simone stepped back to the microphone and announced they had evidence to share that would demonstrate this was not an isolated incident, but systemic discrimination built into Northwest Atlantic Airlines operations at every level. She gestured to her associate, who began the presentation on the screen behind them. For the next 40 minutes, they methodically laid out the case. The algorithm's bias, the warning emails ignored, the thousands of victims, the executive decisions to continue discriminatory practices despite knowing the harm they caused. Each revelation brought gasps and furious note-taking from the assembled journalists. The most damaging moment came when Simone projected Gerald Farnsworth's email onto the screen, the one asking who cares if some people are upset. She read it aloud, slowly, letting each callous word sink in. Then she revealed that Farnsworth was still employed by Northwest Atlantic Airlines in the same position, still making decisions about passenger security, still drawing his substantial salary, while the people his policies harmed went uncompensated and unacknowledged. She announced they were filing a class action lawsuit on behalf of all passengers subjected to discriminatory treatment, seeking $5 billion in damages, and demanding comprehensive changes to the airline's operations. The journalists exploded with questions, shouting over each other. Simone pointed to a reporter from the Washington Post, who asked whether they had proof the algorithm specifically targeted black passengers. Simone nodded to her technical expert, who explained in clear terms how the training data's bias had been encoded into the system, how certain markers correlated strongly with race, how the false positive rate for black passengers was 300% higher than for white passengers with identical booking patterns. A CNN correspondent asked what Darius wanted from Northwest Atlantic Airlines. Darius leaned into the microphone and said quietly that he wanted what everyone deserved: fair treatment, accountability for those who'd built this system, and changes that ensured no one else would suffer what had suffered. He wanted the algorithm destroyed, the policies rewritten, and the executives who'd known about the bias and done nothing to be held responsible for their choices. As the press conference concluded, Simone made one final statement that would be quoted in thousands of articles over the coming days. She looked directly into the cameras and said this wasn't just about one airline or one passenger. This was about how technology was being used to automate centuries-old prejudices, how artificial intelligence without accountability was creating new forms of discrimination harder to identify and fight than the old forms. She called on the government to investigate not just Northwest Atlantic, but the entire industry, to determine how widespread these practices had become. Then she and Darius walked out of the ballroom through a side door, leaving the journalists scrambling to file their stories before their deadlines. Within an hour, the story dominated every news website, every social media platform, every conversation about race and technology and corporate accountability. The hashtag Boycott Northwest Atlantic became the #1 trending topic globally, surpassing even major political news. Airlines began frantically reviewing their own security algorithms. Technology companies issued statements claiming their AI systems were unbiased. Civil rights organizations announced investigations. And Northwest Atlantic Airlines' stock price, which had been slowly recovering, went into free fall. By the closing bell on Wall Street, Northwest Atlantic Airlines had lost 35% of its market value in a single day, erasing $4 billion in shareholder wealth. Financial analysts called it one of the worst single-day drops in aviation history, driven not by mechanical failures or tragic accidents but by the exposure of systematic racism. Major investors demanded emergency board meetings. The CEO, Preston Caldwell, released a statement claiming the company took these allegations seriously and was conducting a thorough internal review. Nobody believed him. Darius sat in his hotel room that evening watching news coverage of the press conference, seeing his own face on screen after screen, hearing commentators debate the implications of AI bias, listening to other victims call in to share their stories. His phone rang constantly, with interview requests, job offers from companies wanting to hire him as a diversity consultant, messages from people he hadn't heard from in years, expressing support or apology for not believing previous complaints about discrimination. The attention felt overwhelming, suffocating, like drowning in recognition that came years too late for the thousands who'd suffered in silence. But amid the chaos, something remarkable was happening. People were listening. People were angry. People were demanding change. And for the first time since that horrible morning at the airport, Darius allowed himself to feel something that might have been hope. The next morning, Darius woke to find that overnight the scandal had evolved from news story into social movement. Protests erupted at major airports across the country as travelers, civil rights activists, and airline employees united in demanding change. At New York's JFK International Airport, over 5,000 people filled the terminal holding signs reading "Black Lives Matter in the sky" and "End AI Racism Now." They marched through the concourses chanting while television cameras captured every moment, their peaceful presence, disrupting normal operations, and forcing the airport authority to issue statements about respecting the right to protest while maintaining security. Similar scenes played out in Los Angeles, Chicago, Atlanta, Miami, and a dozen other cities. College students organized sit-ins at airport ticket counters. Religious leaders held prayer vigils in baggage claim areas. Local politicians joined the protests, some genuinely committed to the cause, others simply recognizing a popular movement they wanted to associate themselves with. The protests remained overwhelmingly peaceful, organizers working hard to maintain discipline and message focus, knowing that any violence would be used to discredit their cause and shift attention away from the discrimination they were fighting. Northwest Atlantic Airlines found itself besieged on all fronts. Customers canceled reservations by the thousands. choosing to pay change fees and fly with competitors rather than support a company exposed as racist. Corporate travel departments at major companies issued directives forbidding employees from booking Northwest Atlantic flights, not wanting their own brands associated with the scandal. Credit card companies that had initially suspended their co-branded cards made those suspensions permanent. Hotels and rental car companies ended partnership programs. The airline's frequent flyer program saw redemptions spike as members rushed to use their miles before the company potentially went bankrupt. The financial pressure mounted daily. Stock analysts downgraded Northwest Atlantic to junk status. Bond ratings fell, making it more expensive for the company to borrow money. Banks that had provided credit lines began demanding additional collateral or threatening to call in loans. Lessors who owned aircraft leased to the airline started quietly exploring options to repossess their planes if payments stopped. Within 1 week of Darius' press conference, Northwest Atlantic had gone from a profitable major carrier to a company facing potential liquidation. Congress responded to the public outcry with the speed that only comes when voters are truly enraged and election season approaches. The House Transportation Committee announced immediate hearings on discrimination in airline security practices. The Senate Commerce Committee scheduled its own investigation. Both committees issued subpoenas to Northwest Atlantic Airlines, demanding all documents related to their security algorithms, requiring testimony from top executives, including CEO Preston Caldwell, and threatening criminal referrals if evidence of intentional civil rights violations emerged. Other airlines, watching Northwest Atlantic's collapse with barely concealed schadenfreude mixed with genuine terror that they might be next, rushed to announce reviews of their own security procedures. United Airlines held a press conference declaring they'd hired an independent civil rights organization to audit their passenger screening algorithms and would implement any recommended changes. Delta Airlines announced they were discontinuing use of AI in security decisions entirely until bias could be guaranteed eliminated. American Airlines revealed they'd never used algorithmic passenger screening, relying instead on traditional security measures. Though this claim was met with skepticism, technology companies that built AI systems for airlines and other industries found themselves facing uncomfortable scrutiny. Congressional investigators began asking questions about the training data used in other contexts: employment screening algorithms, criminal justice risk assessments, loan approval systems, medical diagnosis tools. If airline security AI was biased, what about all these other systems making important decisions about people's lives? Civil rights organizations that had been warning about algorithmic bias for years suddenly found their concerns taken seriously by lawmakers and media outlets that had previously dismissed them as paranoid or anti-technology. Darius became the reluctant symbol of this expanding movement. He appeared on morning talk shows, evening news programs, and cable news panels, always bringing the conversation back to the thousands of other victims whose stories needed telling. He used his platform to highlight the systemic nature of the problem, explaining in terms non-technical audiences could understand how bias entered AI systems and why it was so difficult to detect and eliminate. His calm, articulate presentations contrasted sharply with the aggressive treatment had received, making the injustice even more stark. The movement also produced uncomfortable moments as various groups attempted to co-opt it for their own purposes. Some politicians tried to use the scandal to push unrelated agendas. Some technology skeptics argued it proved AI should be banned entirely. Some activists wanted to expand the focus beyond racial discrimination to include other grievances. Darius and Simone worked hard to keep the movement centered on its core issues: accountability for Northwest Atlantic Airlines, compensation for victims, and meaningful reform to prevent similar discrimination in the future. 2 weeks after the incident, another bombshell dropped. An anonymous whistleblower, later revealed to be a senior software engineer at Northwest Atlantic named Keisha Morrison, released the complete source code of the airline's security algorithm to the media and civil rights organizations. The code proved every allegation Simone had made at the press conference and revealed several issues even worse than suspected. The algorithm didn't just use race as one factor among many. Race was weighted so heavily that it overwhelmed almost all other considerations. A black passenger with a spotless travel history and premium status could be flagged as higher risk than a white passenger with multiple security incidents. Even more damning, the code contained programmer comments that showed the bias wasn't accidental. Someone had explicitly written code to increase risk scores based on racial markers, had tested it to ensure it worked as intended, and had documented their work with comments like adjusted weights to match historical arrest patterns and increased sensitivity for high-risk demographic profiles. These weren't neutral technical decisions. These were choices to build racism into the system, choices made by specific people who could be identified and held accountable. The FBI opened a criminal investigation into potential civil rights violations. The Department of Justice announced it was reviewing whether to file federal charges against Northwest Atlantic Airlines and individual executives. State attorneys general in California, New York, and Illinois initiated their own investigations. The legal walls were closing in from multiple directions, and the company's lawyers knew it. They began reaching out to Simone, floating the possibility of settlement negotiations, trying to contain the damage before it completely destroyed the company. But Simone had no interest in quiet settlements that would let Northwest Atlantic continue operating with minor reforms and sealed agreements. She wanted public accountability, complete transparency, and changes significant enough to serve as warnings to every other company using AI to make decisions about people's lives. She told the airline's lawyers that any settlement discussion must start with full admission of wrongdoing, complete disclosure of all discriminatory practices, termination of all executives who knew about the bias, and compensation for every victim they could identify. The lawyers blanched at these demands, but promised to convey them to their clients. On a gray Monday morning 3 weeks after Darius' nightmare began, 5 current and former Northwest Atlantic Airlines employees held their own press conference at a union hall in Chicago. The media attendance matched the earlier conference in Seattle, journalists recognizing this was the next chapter in a story that kept delivering dramatic revelations. The 5 employees represented different parts of the airline's operations: flight attendants, gate agents, baggage handlers, a pilot, and the former software engineer Keisha Morrison, who had leaked the algorithm's source code. Jasmine Caldwell, a flight attendant with 10 years at Northwest Atlantic, stood at the microphone first. At 32 years old, with dark skin, natural hair, and the bearing of someone who'd spent years smiling through mistreatment, she looked directly into the cameras and began speaking about the company's culture of discrimination that extended far beyond passenger security. She described how black employees received lower performance ratings despite meeting all metrics, how they were passed over for promotions that went to less qualified white colleagues, how complaints about racial harassment disappeared into human resources, black holes where nothing ever happened. She told specific stories with dates and names, having brought documentation to support every claim. In 2023, Shed reported a pilot who regularly made racist jokes during flights, and Human Resources had told her she was being too sensitive. In 2024, Shed applied for a lead flight attendant position she was clearly qualified for, and watched a white woman with half her experience get the job. When Shed asked for feedback, her supervisor had told her she needed to work on her professionalism, a criticism Shed never received before, and which came with no specific examples or guidance on what needed to change. The other employees shared similar experiences, painting a picture of a company where racial discrimination wasn't just embedded in algorithms, but in human decisions at every level. They described training sessions where instructors showed photos of suspicious passengers that disproportionately featured black and brown faces. They talked about informal quotas for additional screenings that were never written down but everyone understood. They revealed that gate agents received bonuses for identifying high-risk passengers who were then denied boarding, creating financial incentives to target vulnerable travelers. Marcus Thorne, a pilot with 15 years at the airline and one of the few black captains in the company's history, described how he had been questioned by airport security multiple times while in uniform, walking to his own aircraft to fly it. His credentials were scrutinized more closely than his white colleagues. Passengers sometimes expressed surprise or concern when they saw him in the cockpit, and the company's response to these incidents was to suggest he try to appear more professional rather than addressing the racist assumptions underlying the complaints. Keisha Morrison, the software engineer who'd leaked the source code at great personal and professional risk, explained how Shed raised concerns about the algorithm's bias during development, but was told by management that the system was working as intended. Shed documented her objections in emails that she now provided to investigators, showing that the discrimination wasn't just known, but deliberately chosen. When Shed continued pushing for changes, She'd been moved to a different project and given performance reviews questioning her team fit and collaborative attitude. The message was clear: stop complaining or lose your job. The employees announced they'd filed a separate class action lawsuit on behalf of all black employees at Northwest Atlantic Airlines, alleging systematic racial discrimination in hiring, promotion, compensation, and working conditions. They'd also filed complaints with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, providing evidence of bias that spanned decades. And they were calling on other employees to come forward with their own stories, promising legal protection and support for whistleblowers willing to tell the truth about what they'd witnessed. The press conference lasted 2 hours as journalists asked detailed questions about specific incidents and patterns of discrimination. The employees answered calmly and thoroughly, their credibility enhanced by the documentation they provided and the obvious personal cost of speaking out. Several still worked for Northwest Atlantic and knew they'd likely be fired despite legal protections for whistleblowers. Others had already lost their jobs or been constructively forced out. They were sacrificing their careers to expose the truth, and their courage resonated with viewers watching across the country. That afternoon, another critical piece of evidence emerged. An anonymous hacker collective released internal Northwest Atlantic Airlines emails dating back 5 years, showing executives discussing the algorithm's bias and explicitly deciding to accept it as an acceptable cost of their security approach. The emails revealed a sophisticated understanding of both the bias and its illegality, with lawyers warning that the system violated civil rights laws and recommending changes that executives rejected as too expensive or operationally complex. One email chain between CEO Preston Caldwell and COO Margaret Finch discussed whether to inform the board of directors about the bias risks. Caldwell had written that full disclosure might create liability, suggesting instead they present the algorithm as an innovative security enhancement, without mentioning the disparate impact on minority passengers. This wasn't negligence or ignorance. This was calculated decision-making to prioritize profits over civil rights, to hide discrimination rather than fix it. The FBI escalated its investigation to include potential criminal charges of conspiracy to violate civil rights. Federal prosecutors convened a grand jury to hear evidence. The Department of Transportation announced it was suspending Northwest Atlantic's operating certificate pending review, effectively grounding the airline until safety and security procedures could be verified as non-discriminatory. Without flights, the airline had no revenue, and bankruptcy became inevitable within days. Darius watched these developments from his apartment, feeling a mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. Justice was being served, But the process revealed how deep the rot went. How many people had known and done nothing? How many victims had suffered before him? He received thousands of messages from those victims, thanking him for speaking out, sharing their own stories of humiliation and abuse, asking what they could do to help. He tried to respond to as many as possible, but the volume overwhelmed his capacity. Simone called him with news that Northwest Atlantic's lawyers had contacted her with a settlement offer. The company would admit wrongdoing, compensate all identified victims, destroy the biased algorithm, implement comprehensive reforms, and donate $50 million to civil rights organizations focused on AI bias. It was more than most lawsuits achieved. But Simone wanted Darius' input before responding. He thought for a long moment, then asked whether the settlement included accountability for the executives who'd built and maintained the discriminatory system. Simone said they were still employed, the company claiming terminating them would constitute retaliation that complicated settlement negotiations. Darius told her no deal. Not without accountability. If the people who'd made these choices kept their jobs and their bonuses and their reputations intact, nothing would really change. They'd just build new systems with discrimination hidden better, make the same choices with more careful documentation. The next Darius would suffer the same treatment, and the company would once again choose profit over justice. Simone agreed and told Northwest Atlantic's lawyers the settlement was rejected. They'd see them in court. 3 months after Darius Whitmore tried to board Flight 447 and instead became the catalyst for systemic change, he stood in a committee room in the Rayburn House office building in Washington, D.C. The city head originally planned to visit for a presentation that now seemed to have happened in another lifetime. This time he came not as a defendant or victim but as an expert witness, invited to testify before Congress about the AI Accountability Act, legislation that had moved from initial proposal to near certain passage with remarkable speed. The committee room was packed with representatives, staffers, journalists, and members of the public lucky enough to secure visitor passes. Darius sat at the witness table alongside civil rights leaders, technology ethicists, and other victims of algorithmic discrimination. He wore a dark blue suit and carried himself with quiet confidence that came from knowing his story had mattered. His suffering had produced meaningful change. His voice had been heard by people with power to act. Senator Letitia Monroe, a black woman from Georgia who'd championed civil rights throughout her career, chaired the hearing. She opened with remarks acknowledging that government moved slowly, but sometimes public outcry demanded swift action. And this was such a moment. She thanked Darius by name for his courage, and applause erupted in the gallery until she gently reminded everyone that demonstrations weren't permitted in congressional hearings. Darius testified for 30 minutes, explaining in clear terms how AI systems could encode and amplify human biases, how lack of transparency made discrimination harder to detect and challenge, how accountability mechanisms were necessary to ensure companies prioritized civil rights over convenience. He spoke without notes, drawing on months of conversations with victims, researchers, advocates, and his own deep understanding of the technology. Representatives from both parties asked thoughtful questions, and Darius answered each one thoroughly, his credibility unassailable. The AI Accountability Act passed the House of Representatives the following week with 395 votes in favor and only 25 opposed. The Senate followed suit 3 days later. The president signed it into law in a ceremony that Darius attended. Standing behind the president as the pens used for signing were distributed to key advocates who'd made the legislation possible. Darius received one of those pens, a symbol of how far He'd come from that morning at the airport when He'd been treated as a threat rather than a citizen deserving equal protection under the law. The law required all companies using artificial intelligence in decisions affecting civil rights to conduct regular bias audits performed by independent experts, disclose their methodologies in sufficient detail to allow meaningful review, and establish accountability mechanisms, including penalties for executives who knowingly deployed discriminatory systems. It created a federal office within the Department of Justice dedicated to investigating AI discrimination complaints. It mandated training for judges and lawyers on how to evaluate algorithmic bias claims. It gave victims legal tools to challenge unfair automated decisions and recover damages when discrimination was proven. Northwest Atlantic Airlines did not survive long enough to comply with the new law. The company filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy 6 weeks after Darius' press conference, unable to sustain operations without revenue, as the flight ban remained in effect pending resolution of civil rights violations. A competitor, Horizon Airways, purchased the airline's most valuable assets, including planes, routes, and landing slots. But not the brand name, which had become so toxic that marketing experts said it would take decades to rehabilitate. Former Northwest Atlantic employees were offered positions with Horizon, but only after completing mandatory anti-discrimination training and agreeing to work under new policies that explicitly prohibited racial profiling. CEO Preston Caldwell resigned in disgrace and faced federal criminal charges for conspiracy to violate civil rights. COO Margaret Finch and VP of Operations Gerald Farnsworth also faced charges. The legal proceedings would take years, but prosecutors felt confident they had evidence for convictions given the damning email trails and witness testimony from former employees. Several mid-level managers accepted plea deals in exchange for cooperating with investigators, further strengthening cases against senior leadership. Simone Harper's class action lawsuit settled for $1 billion, distributed among 10,000 victims, who had been subjected to discriminatory treatment by Northwest Atlantic security algorithms. Darius received $2 million as the named plaintiff whose courage initiated the case, but he immediately donated $1 million to the Fair Flight Initiative, the nonprofit organization Head founded to continue fighting algorithmic discrimination across industries. The initiative hired a team of engineers, lawyers, and investigators who would audit AI systems, represent victims, and advocate for stronger regulations. Darius himself underwent a remarkable transformation over those 3 months. Head lost his job when the company Head worked for decided his notoriety made him a liability rather than an asset. But Head gained opportunities that better aligned with his values and allowed him to make a greater impact. Georgetown University offered him a visiting professorship teaching ethics in computer science. 3 major technology companies wanted him as a consultant reviewing their AI systems for bias. The MacArthur Foundation awarded him a Genius Grant, recognizing his contributions to advancing civil rights in the digital age. Head also found something unexpected: connection with Ruby Patterson, a law professor at Georgetown who'd testified alongside him at the congressional hearings. They'd started talking after the hearings ended, discovered they shared not just professional interests but similar backgrounds and experiences navigating predominantly white institutions, and began spending time together beyond work. Ruby had grown up in Atlanta, studied at Yale and Stanford, and spent her career examining how law and technology intersected, often in ways that disadvantaged vulnerable communities. She understood what Darius had experienced in ways most people couldn't. Their relationship developed slowly as both carried wariness from past relationships that had failed under the pressure of demanding careers and the particular stresses facing successful Black professionals in America. But they made time for each other despite busy schedules. Meeting for coffee that turned into lunch, that turned into dinner, that turned into weekends, exploring Washington's museums and neighborhoods. Darius found himself laughing more, smiling more, imagining futures that included more than just work and advocacy. He moved to Washington 6 weeks after the congressional testimony, settling into a small but comfortable townhouse in Alexandria with views of the Potomac River. The house needed work, and he spent weekends painting walls and refinishing floors. Simple physical tasks that brought satisfaction different from intellectual work. Ruby often came over to help, and they'd work side by side while discussing cases, sharing stories about difficult students, debating the best approaches to achieving lasting change in systems resistant to reform. One crisp autumn morning, Darius received an email that made him stare at the screen for several long moments before fully processing what he was reading. The email came from Officer Drake, the airport security guard who had thrown him to the floor, handcuffed him, dragged him away. Darius' first instinct was to delete it unread, not wanting to subject himself to whatever justification or excuse the man might offer. But curiosity overcame anger, and he clicked open the message. Drake's email was long, single-spaced, clearly written over multiple drafts. He began by acknowledging that no apology could undo the harm Head caused. That Head replayed that morning 1,000 times in his mind, with shame burning his conscience. Head quit his job at airport security 2 weeks after the incident, unable to continue working in a system he now recognized as corrupt and corrupting. Head spent months in therapy working through his own biases and the training that had taught him to see threats where none existed. Head joined an organization that trained law enforcement officers in anti-racist policing practices, volunteering his time to speak at workshops about how easy it was to become complicit in discrimination when you accepted the systems around you without question. The email explained that Drake had grown up in a small town where the only black people he encountered were on television or in news stories about crime. Head joined the military after high school, where Head learned to follow orders and trust procedures. Head become airport security because it seemed like continuing his service protecting people from danger. Head never questioned whether the procedures he followed were just, never examined whether the threats Head been trained to identify were real or imagined, never considered that he might be causing harm while believing he was ensuring safety. Meeting Darius that morning had confirmed for Drake everything Head been taught about suspicious passengers and appropriate responses to non-compliance. But watching the video afterward, seeing himself through other people's eyes, hearing the outrage and condemnation from people he respected, had cracked something open inside him. Had been forced to confront the reality that Head assaulted an innocent man for the crime of being black and objecting to discriminatory treatment. That realization had broken him, and Head spent the months since trying to rebuild himself into someone who could contribute to solutions rather than problems. Drake's email ended with a request to meet in person if Darius felt able to do so, not for Drake's sake but because he wanted to apologize properly, face to face, and offer whatever amends might be possible. He provided his phone number and address, leaving the decision entirely to Darius without pressure or expectation. Darius sat staring at the email for a long time. His first reaction was anger. The same anger Head felt that morning when Drake's knee pressed between his shoulder blades and his face scraped against airport carpet. Part of him wanted to write back that no meeting would ever happen, that Drake could live with his guilt as Darius had lived with trauma and disruption and fear. But another part recognized something genuine in the email's tone, something that spoke to actual transformation rather than performance of regret designed to ease conscience without requiring real change. He called Simone and read her the email, asking for advice. She was quiet for several moments before responding that this was entirely Darius' choice to make, that he owed Drake nothing, but that sometimes confronting those who'd harmed us could be powerful for our own healing regardless of whether it helped them. She offered to attend any meeting as support if Darius decided to go forward. He thanked her and sat with the decision for several days, discussing it with Ruby, who listened without judgment and supported whatever choice he made. Finally, Darius responded to Drake's email with a brief message agreeing to meet at a coffee shop in downtown Washington on a Saturday afternoon when they'd both have time and space to talk without rushing. Drake responded within minutes, thanking him and promising to be there. The meeting was difficult, awkward, charged with emotion, neither man could fully contain. Drake looked older than Darius remembered, gray hair more prominent, lines deeper around his eyes, shoulders hunched, as though carrying visible weight. He stood when Darius arrived, started to extend his hand, then seemed to think better of it, and sat back down. Darius took the chair across from him, and they sat in uncomfortable silence for several beats before Drake began speaking in a low voice filled with regret. He repeated much of what had written in the email, but hearing the words spoken aloud gave them different weight. Drake's voice broke several times as he described watching himself in the viral video, recognizing that had become the exact type of person had once believed himself incapable of being, had hurt someone who'd done nothing wrong, had used violence against someone asking for justice, had been the face of institutional racism, even if had never consciously considered himself racist. Darius listened without interrupting, letting Drake speak until he ran out of words. Then Darius spoke, telling Drake that he appreciated the apology but needed Drake to understand that forgiveness wasn't something he could offer because the harm extended beyond personal injury. Drake had been part of a system that victimized thousands of people, and while his individual transformation mattered, it didn't undo that systemic harm. The question wasn't whether Darius could forgive Drake, but whether Drake would commit the rest of his life to actively fighting the systems he'd once served. Drake nodded and said that was exactly what he intended to do. That he understood words meant nothing without action, that he hoped through his work training other officers he could prevent future harm even if he couldn't repair past damage. They talked for 2 hours about racism, about systems, about how good people become complicit in evil through small compromises and uncritical acceptance of authority. Neither man left as friends, but they parted with understanding that they were both, in their own ways, trying to build something better from the ruins of what had been. 6 months after the incident, on a bright March morning with cherry blossoms beginning to bloom across Washington, Darius boarded an airplane for the first time since his arrest. He was flying to New York for a speaking engagement at Columbia University, and had deliberately chosen to fly rather than take the train despite the anxiety that had gripped him since booking the ticket. Ruby had offered to come with him, but had told her this was something he needed to do alone. To prove to himself that he could reclaim this space, that he wouldn't let fear control his choices. The airline was Delta, not Northwest Atlantic's successor, and had chosen them partly for their stated commitment to fair treatment, and partly because flying on any airline required an act of faith he wasn't ready to extend to a company with Northwest Atlantic's DNA. He arrived at Reagan National 2 hours early, his heart pounding as he approached the security checkpoint. But this time, the process was smooth, uneventful, almost boring in its normalcy. The TSA agent checked his ID with professional efficiency. His bag went through the scanner without incident. He walked through the metal detector with no alarm. At the gate, the airline employee who scanned his boarding pass looked up with recognition spreading across her face. Ashley Rivera, according to her name tag, was perhaps 25 years old, with warm brown eyes and dark hair pulled back in the airline's standard style. She smiled and said quietly that it was an honor to have him on the flight, that what had done had changed things for people like her who worked in the industry and wanted it to be better. Darius thanked her, surprised by the emotion that rose in his throat at this small gesture of recognition and respect. He boarded the plane, found his seat by the window, and settled in with the careful breathing exercises his therapist had taught him for managing anxiety. The seat next to him remained empty as passengers filed past, and he found himself grateful for the extra space. As the plane filled up, a flight attendant stopped by his row. A young black man named Malik, who handed him a bottle of water and asked if there was anything he needed. Darius looked up at him and saw someone who'd probably faced his own challenges in this industry, who was making sure one of his own felt welcomed and safe. The plane taxied to the runway, engines spinning up with that particular roar that's both thrilling and terrifying. And then they were accelerating, pressing back into seats, lifting off the ground. Darius looked out the window at the city falling away, below the monuments and government buildings where laws had been passed because Head refused to stay silent, the universities where he now taught students to build technology that served rather than harmed, the life Head rebuilt from the ashes of that terrible morning. He opened his laptop and began working on his presentation for Columbia, but his mind drifted to his mother, wondering what she'd think of everything that had happened. She'd raised him to stand up for what was right, even when it cost him, to never accept injustice simply because fighting it was hard, to believe that one person could make a difference if they refused to be silenced. He hoped She'd be proud of the man He'd become, of the changes He'd helped create, of the courage He'd found when everything seemed lost. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, and Darius looked out at clouds stretching to the horizon, pure white against brilliant blue sky. The world looked different from up here, problems shrinking to manageable size, possibilities expanding to fill the visible universe. He knew the work wasn't finished, that discrimination would find new forms and new technologies would create new challenges, that vigilance and advocacy were lifetime commitments rather than temporary projects. But today, in this moment, flying toward the next chapter of his journey, Darius allowed himself to feel something close to peace. What happened to Darius changed more than just airline policies. It sparked conversations about artificial intelligence and bias in every industry. It led to federal legislation protecting civil rights in the digital age. It inspired thousands of people to speak up about their own experiences with discrimination. It proved that one person's courage could challenge systems that seemed too powerful to defeat. And perhaps most importantly, it reminded everyone that behind every algorithm, every automated decision, every efficient procedure, there are human beings making choices about whose dignity matters and whose suffering is acceptable. So let me ask you, do you think enough has changed, or is there more work to do? Have you ever experienced discrimination that seemed too small to fight but too painful to ignore? Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts, and make sure you hit that like button if this story moved you. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because there are thousands more stories like Darius that need to be told, and your support helps us tell them. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear it, who's fighting their own battles, who feels alone in standing up for what's right. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And remember, justice takes time, but it's worth fighting for. Change is possible when we refuse to stay silent. Every voice matters. Every story counts. And together we can build systems that treat everyone with the dignity and respect they deserve. May your own journey be filled with courage when you need it, support when you seek it, and the knowledge that speaking truth to power is never a waste of time. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and I'll see you in the next story. This story teaches us that systemic discrimination often hides behind technology and procedures that claim objectivity. Algorithms trained on biased data perpetuate racism rather than eliminate it, automating prejudice at scale while shielding those responsible behind claims of neutral math. Speaking up matters, even when the cost seems unbearable. Darius could have stayed silent, accepted his humiliation, and moved on. Instead, his courage exposed discrimination, affecting thousands, and sparked legislative change, protecting millions. Individual bravery combined with collective action creates unstoppable momentum for justice. The whistleblowers, protesters, journalists, and ordinary people who amplified Darius' story transformed one man's nightmare into a movement corporations and governments couldn't ignore. Accountability requires transparency. Without the forced disclosure of Northwest Atlantic's algorithms and internal communications, the company would have continued discriminating while denying wrongdoing. Sunlight truly is the best disinfectant. Change takes time but accelerates when people demand it. 3 months from incident to federal legislation represents lightning speed for systemic reform, achieved because citizens refuse to accept empty promises and performative gestures. Finally, reconciliation without accountability enables future harm. Drake's transformation mattered, but only because he committed to active anti-racism work, not merely apologizing. Justice requires both individual growth and structural change, personal reckoning and policy reform, acknowledgement of harm and concrete steps, ensuring it never happens again. Has this story changed how you think about artificial intelligence and civil rights? Have you or someone you know experienced discrimination in travel, employment, or other areas where algorithms make decisions about your life? Share your story in the comments below, because every voice adds to our collective understanding and strengthens the movement for justice. If you believe everyone deserves equal treatment regardless of race, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss stories about people fighting for change and winning against impossible odds. Share this video with your family, friends, co-workers, and anyone who needs to understand how racism evolves with technology and why we must remain vigilant in defending civil rights in the digital age. Thank you for taking the time to watch Darius' journey from victim to advocate, from one man standing alone to a catalyst for systemic reform. Your engagement matters more than you know. Every view, like, comment, and share helps these important stories reach people who need them most. May you find courage when facing injustice, support when standing for what's right, and hope that your actions can change the world. Remember, silence enables oppression, but your voice contributes to liberation. Stay informed, stay engaged, and never doubt that ordinary people create extraordinary change when they refuse to accept inequality. Take care, stay strong, and I'll see you in the next story, where we continue exploring how individuals transform systems and justice prevails when people persist.